Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 5 from Marvel Comics in 1989. The long retreat from Moscow continues for John Doe, the titular Ultimate Ninja, accompanied by his mentor Irving Yagyu, DDS, Sergeant Deb Levins, and Sasha, the Russian Boy Scout who fell in with 3 Americans after helping to save their lives from Russian commandos last issue. Sasha's having a bit of a breakdown here, as seen on the cover, given that he's a child who understands that he's committed treason. The narrative is getting more complex as the series progresses. The issue begins in 1968 with Dr. Yagyu crawling through tunnels in Cu Chi, Vietnam, having been sent from America to assassinate a certain North Vietnamese poet. In these tunnels, we're also introduced to Tyrone Parrish, who gives his life saving Dr. Yagyu from a VC grenade. That's why and how Dr. Yagyu ends up at the Iowa orphanage, where John Doe and Alfie O'Megan were raised, and where he first crosses paths with the boy who would become his star pupil. Already we're given evidence that the time stream has been changed, or is being changed by Alfie's powers. His first taste of time travel sends the young Alfie around the bend, a process that results in him learning to see multiple points simultaneously. The similarities to Watchmen are inescapable, with a godlike being suffering dissociative episodes based on his inability to parse the passage of time. The difference here is that Alfie is anything but detached from the world around him. On the contrary, Alfie is very much engaged, paranoid, resentful, and angry. An assassination attempt inspires him to transform into Godzilla, crushing a mob of screaming soldiers into a thin paste. Meanwhile, Colonel Novikova, under interrogation from the American intelligence liaison officer stationed with the Chinese army prior to being offered a job of hunting the AWOL John Doe. The theme here is one of Hammer's oldest, a consistent note strummed throughout the entire run of his G.I. Joe. Wars are often just a distraction for the subterranean movements of intelligence agencies, buried agendas that inevitably diverge and even conflict with the rationales proffered to the soldiers fighting and dying. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Slain the Horned God number 2 from 1993 in Fleetway quality. Slain's quest to unite the tribes against the menace of the Lord Weird Slough-Fag gets underway upon the king's return from his communion with the Earth Goddess. Slain's ambition is compromised, however, by the machinations of Migrim, the widow of Slain's brother, and unbeknownst to Slain, the consort of his great nemesis, the Death Wizard Slough-Fag. We meet him in these pages, a pitiful wretch 20,000 years old enough to remember and resent the ancient matriarchy that preceded the Celts, and which is still celebrated by that same goddess of Slain's recent acquaintance. There are 2 horned gods here. There's Carnoon, the god of laughter and dancing and fertility, whose aegis is sought by Slain, but the Lord Weird is also horned, a dry bag of bones taught by great elk antlers, and who persists in a shambling parody of life. Slough-Fag is, after all, lord of death and decay, rotten oblivion, implacable enemy to Slain's patron goddess, whose eternal youth and lasciviousness is an affront to any conscientious death cultist. Throughout, the story comes alive with Bisley's paint. What makes his work so special is the way in which he communicates caricature and humor with color. We all know painted comics can be stiff in the hands of lesser artists. Bisley breaks that mold with powerful imagery on every page. His drawings look like cartoons, move like cartoons, never losing an ounce of the spontaneity that serves as a calling card. The key here is that Bisley's no slave to realistic representation. Every aspect of his work is laced with exaggeration, from ghoulish and cretinous monsters through to the impossibly curvaceous women who surround Slain. The world that we see here makes no attempt to ground the fantastic through counterfeit mimesis. Rather, he seems to embrace the influence of an artist like Ralph Steadman, who filtered material reality through the fantastic in such a way as to shake the moorings of both. It's not hard to see why this work took the industry by storm. It's still dynamite, revelatory work after all these years, truly in a class by itself. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Open Space number 0 from 1990 Marvel and Wizard. This is a very special artifact in the career of one Mr. Alex Ross. Ross made his comics debut in 1990 for Now Comics on Terminator: The Burning Earth. That series attracted Marvel's attention, specifically Kurt Busiek, then editing a sci-fi anthology called Open Space. On the strength of The Terminator, Busiek reached out to Ross about doing a story for the book's 5th issue. The work was commissioned, completed, and paid for, but wouldn't you know, Open Space didn't make it past issue 4. Sadly, regardless of quality, sci-fi anthologies have been a tough sell since the days of EC. So, this would not be Ross's first published work for Marvel. Through a circuitous chain of events, that would actually be in the pages of Hellraiser, about the least Alex Ross franchise imaginable. But, credit to Clive Barker and any retelling of Ross's career. He personally intervened to get Ross comics work when no other doors were open. From Hellraiser, it was a straight shot to Marvel's, and from there to the history books. But, that still left the original Open Space story in limbo. It didn't see print until 1999. 1989, when Wizard put together a special issue on Ross that included that story as an exclusive zero issue for the long-canceled anthology. The story itself, by Lawrence Watt Evans, is actually really good, well worth tracking down. A planetary surveying mission finds something that looks an awful lot like life that just happens to be in the way of where someone wants to build condos. The bonus material offers a fascinating view into the artist's earliest work habits. Detailed thumbnails followed by that famous photographic reference. The main character here played by his sister, Geneva Ross. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Robin number 6 from 1994 in DC Comics. Strange as it may seem in hindsight, after 50 years of publication, no one had thought to give Batman's sidekick his own book until the early 90s. Even then, the process entailed multiple miniseries, holograms and polybags were involved, if memory serves me well, before finally launching the Boy Wonder's first ongoing in the aftermath of 1993's Nightfall. Also the first time they ever thought to give Catwoman her own book, a season of obvious wins for the distinguished competition. And, miracle of miracles, the book was actually pretty good. Like just about everything that came out of Denny O'Neill's Bad Office, there was a ground floor of competency that served these books in good stead during an era when readable could be a struggle. So too here, with solid prose, Chuck Dixon and Tom Grummett behind the helm for the series' first stretch, establishing the character in the definite and conscious mode of Spider-Man, an older kid with older kid problems, offset by also having to spend school nights out beating up members of the Mafia with a stick. The reason we're looking at this comic book today, however, has more to do with the guest artist, Mr. Phil Jimenez. This was far from his first work for the company, and in fact he'd been floating around for a while, mostly providing well-regarded fill-ins, such as a handful of issues of books like Guy Gardner Warrior, The New Titans, and The Teen Titans. He's accompanied here by Romeo Tanghal, frequent Titans inker and George Perez collaborator. The comparisons between Jimenez and Perez were clearly both justified and also somewhat besides the point. Perez's style was grounded so firmly in skill and patience that any attempt to replicate it could only be pulled off by someone with a significant degree of talent themselves. So too here in the second part of a team-up between Tim Drake and the Helena Bertinelli Huntress, facing off against some vigorous Italian-American stereotypes. This should by all rights have been by the numbers, but Jimenez didn't have it in him to phone it in. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Fantastic Four Annual number 17 from 1983 in Marvel Comics. After exiting his genre-defining run on X-Men with writer Chris Claremont, in 1981 John Byrne decamped to assume drawing and writing duties on Fantastic Four. It wasn't Byrne's first work on Marvel's first family, no. Byrne actually penciled a run on the book about a year previous for writers Bill Mantlo and Marv Wolfman that ran concurrent with the build-up to the Dark Phoenix saga. Yes, you heard that right. Considering how popular and influential that run of X-Men comics was, it wasn't even Byrne's only gig during the period. What's more, his writing debut on the team came a little later with a two-parter in issues 220 to 221, right in the middle of the Bill Sienkiewicz run on Fantastic Four. So, when he finally came aboard as writer and artist with issue 232, he was no stranger to the book or characters. His run at just over 5 years was credited with pulling one of Marvel's most venerable books out of a sleepy holding pattern, redefining the team for the new decade. This annual, though not particularly a significant book in the context of Byrne's run, would turn out to be far more important in hindsight. This is one of a handful of follow-ups to the original Skrull story from Fantastic Four number 2. If you recall, that very first encounter with the sinister alien shape-changers ended on an anticlimax, with Reed Richards hypnotizing a group of Skrulls into becoming cows. As clever as this resolution was at the time, it represented an itch that successive generations of creators could not resist scratching, be it in the pages of the Avengers during the first Kree-Skrull War, or subsequent clashes. Here we're given one further essential ingredient, the integration of alien Skrull fauna into industrial farming systems and ultimately the human food chain. The story follows Sharon Selleck, a supporting character from Byrne's time on the book. Her car breaks down on the road trip in upstate New York, marooning her near King's Crossing, where she immediately understands something very strange is happening. Despite an unsuccessful escape attempt, she still manages to contact the Fantastic Four. Remembering the relevance of King's Crossing to one of their very earliest adventures, the team arrives loaded for bear against the Skrull infiltration, even as the ultimate threat is less aggressive than merely isolationist. The important thing for our purposes today is that the ball was kicked further down the road regarding the long-term consequences of the Skrull contamination of the food supply. A little over a decade later, Grant Morrison and Mark Millar, of all people, pulled this thread for the first Skrull Kill Crew miniseries in the mid-90s, and finally, over a decade again after that, the disposition of those characters would be revisited during the original Secret Invasion series, which saw the Kill Crew reunited to once again take on the revealed Skrull threat. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Dogman and the League of Misfits from 2023 in Scholastic Press. Now, I must report to you that this is actually my first experience with the work of Dav Pilkey. I was way too old for the Captain Underpants series, and even older than that when the Dogman books premiered. Of course, in 2023, Dogman is the best-selling comic book series in the country, or so I've heard. What better opportunity to see what all the fuss is about than this convenient package made available for this year's new comic book day? So, given that I walked in cold with no prior familiarity with the series, what did I think? Well, in the first place, it didn't make too much sense, given that all these characters are well established from previous books, and according to the author's notes, these are older versions of the characters to boot. But with those caveats, I really enjoyed this comic and wish it had been twice as long. The basic plot focuses on the machinations of an evil cat named Petey, brought onto a talk show supposedly to explain his many and varied acts of depravity. By means of exculpatory evidence, he plays a video appropriately titled Framed, the Petey the Cat story. Of course, he uses this distraction to escape, tying up the host and the studio audience so he can return to his headquarters and unleash his latest evil scheme, Timmy the Toilet, who is a talking toilet who sings Pussycat Doll songs. Not a reference I expect the kindergarten crew to get, definitely one for the parents. In any event, I found the book to be an utter delight. Regardless of the audience, this is a genuinely funny book that definitely makes me want to see more from Pilkey. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Beware the Creeper number 5 from DC Vertigo in 2003, and so our story grinds to an inevitable conclusion as the events of the previous 4 issues are revealed as mere preliminary to the final realization of the Creeper's revenge. After the train derailment and unanticipated civilian deaths in the previous issue, the Creeper has lost her patina of rebellious cool. She's a cold-blooded murderer, no longer a member of the avant-garde, but a villain to be persecuted. This is ultimately a tragedy. The Creeper here exists not to twist the nose of the aristocracy, but to enact the revenge of Madeline Benoit for the death of her sister at the hands of the scion of the Arbogast fortune. The Creeper's a strange figure in the history of DC. Despite the character's pedigree as a creation of Steve Ditko, they lack a truly defining run. But in a way, that only makes sense. The Creeper represents chaos, one of many later Ditko creations to take up the theme of mental illness as a powerful, destabilizing force. In that respect, Beware the Creeper is loyal to the character's roots. Madeline Benoit is driven mad by the death of her sister Judith in issue 1, but she's possessed of a fiendish strength that allows her to channel this madness as a potent tool for the cleansing of ubiquitous and suffocating hypocrisy. Through it all, Cliff Chang's art is an unwavering, rock-steady tour de force, a potent reminder for anyone only familiar with the last decade of his work. He was always this good. Beware the Creeper shares an undeniable kinship with his recent work on Catwoman, Lonely City, another story of a strong woman set against a whole town. Jason Hall's script is both subtle and solid, a disciplined tale of spiraling disaster that snaps into sharp focus in these final pages. Without question, Beware the Creeper is a buried treasure, a forgotten triumph worthy of your immediate reappraisal. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 6 from Marvel Comics in 1989. As good as the previous 5 issues of Nth Man have been, it seems as if this is the issue where they really start to cook. There's a lot of ingredients here, and they've taken a little while to put together. In the first place, Larry Hamm is writing a military book that goes one step further than the toyetic scrum of G.I. Joe by replacing the toys with actual grown-up military units, wargaming a version of World War III that doesn't involve thermonuclear destruction. In the second place, he's writing a book about a small group of people who just happen to fall into the orbit of a capricious living god. And not just any living god, an amoral sociopath with enough power to pretend to be Galactus, just like in the Fantastic Four comics he read as a kid. Although I do believe that much of the book takes Watchmen as a springboard, the final element that really clicks into place this issue is a criticism of fanboy culture, already rancid by the late 80s and in many ways antithetical to Ham's oft-stated preferences as both a creator and a fan. Alfie O'Meagan's resentful entitlement, even if reinforced by a genuinely unpleasant childhood, is a prophetic fable about how, for some people, everything will never be enough. This issue sees Alfie demolishing the Lincoln Memorial, for instance, just so he has a nice place to sit while he watches TV in his Galactus cosplay. And of course, we have the figure of John Doe, close in conception to Snake Eyes, another cool-as-a-cucumber ninja type, albeit one more adapted to a world where superpowers are a real thing, if extraordinarily rare. As far as high concepts go, Snake Eyes versus Dr. Manhattan isn't so bad. The only thing missing for Larry Hama Bingo is an incongruous, funny animal, but with 10 issues to go, I'm hopeful that we can get there. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Slain the Horned God #2 from 1993 in Fleetway quality. Anyone new to Slain coming in cold might otherwise be surprised by the strip's talky nature. There's a lot of exposition, lore in the form of Celtic myth and politics, not to mention humor and even a bit of natural history. All well and good, I hear you say, bristling slightly in your chair, but this is Bisley drawing ancient Celtic barbarian kings, and so far in the story we've seen Slain do much more in the way of talking than fighting, to say nothing of loving. As the great sages have said, where's the beef? Well, the beef is here. Slain gets onto a dragon to fly to the far north in order to borrow the Spear of the Sun, one of the last of the ancient weapons he needs to unite the tribes against the Lord Weird Sloth-Fag. Well, wouldn't you know, the witch Migrim, who already tried to kill Slain last issue with a ghoul, is still at it. Here she summons a ghost dragon from another dimension. So, in case you were worried we wouldn't get to see Slain fighting a dragon, rejoice, for there is indeed a dragon fight in these pages. There's also a bit of attention paid to spear technology this issue, with an aside about the mythical spear Gay Bulga, given by the warrior woman Scathach to the great hero Cuchulainn in the Ulster cycle. And underlined here is a woman's invention, a spear cast with 30 barbs, such as it goes in the body with great ease, but will eviscerate upon removal. Fun stuff. The real main event is the actual Spear of Lug itself, shown as constantly on fire and described as incessantly screaming and bleeding, such that even in storage we are told it has to be strapped down to a drain pipe. It can find its target in any battle and return to its wielder's hand with the simple magic words Ibar and Athabar. Do we get to see Slain slaughter the ghost dragon with the Spear of Lug? You bet your ass we do. Next issue, we're promised a great fight between Slain and one of the last living Neanderthals, the bestial Avank. That should be fun. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel Tales 250 from 1991 in Marvel Comics. This giant-size anniversary issue of the company's most venerable reprint book reprints another of the company's significant anniversaries, the 100th issue of Marvel Team-Up from 1980, perhaps the best issue in the entire run of that Bronze Age staple, thanks to the creative team, Chris Claremont and Frank Miller, together on Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. Now, this is one of a handful of Spider-Man stories Miller did, which some, namely me, consider as among his very best material. Just a week, one short week before this hit stands, so too did the 14th Amazing Spider-Man Annual, with Miller drawing a Spider-Man Doctor Strange team up against Doctor Doom, written by Denny O'Neil with inks by Tom Palmer. The following year, Miller returned with O'Neil for the next Spider-Man Annual, drawn by Klaus Janson on inks for a Punisher team up against Dr. Octopus. This is my favorite Miller. I think he drew a dynamite Spider-Man. He wasn't trying to make any kind of grand statement, and that's a big reason why the stories work so well. Bile writes this should be a lark. Claremont and Miller, at the height of their early success, coming together at the precise moment when a team-up between the creators of Dark Phoenix and Elektra would have made the biggest possible impact, bashing out the classic Marvel misunderstanding formula. Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four are the oldest of friends. What possible reason do they have for fighting? The answer is that hoariest of staples, mind control, in the form of this issue's big character introduction, Karma, the first of the New Mutants to make her debut, 2 years in advance of the rest of the team in the pages of Marvel graphic novel #4. It's in this conceit that we find the issue's stylistic hook. Much of the story is concerned with Karma mind-controlling both Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, and so is concerned with exploring, as if for the first time, how these characters move and work on the page. The opening sequence with Karma getting the hang of Spider-Man's unintuitive power set is an opportunity for Miller to play with a double-page spread of thin vertical panels, as well as showing Spider-Man learning to crawl and smash a brick wall. When Spider-Man comes into conflict with the Fantastic Four, the issue soars to sublime heights, climaxing in an extended battle on the waterfront, with Miller utilizing every trick at his disposal to fit an extended brawl between 5 titans into the space provided. One particular page, which I would rate as perhaps the finest single page in Miller's entire corpus, is a simple stack of 4 horizontal panels, featuring the 5 characters all bouncing kinetically between different layers of the picture plane. If you want to see Miller's debt to Ditko, check out the way he draws Ditko's expressive hands throughout the issue. Clearly he's having fun here and showcasing his most primal influences. Add in a quick Rocket Racer backup by veterans Tony Isabella and Paul Kupperberg, and even a Fred Hembeck page to commemorate the anniversary, and this is easily the best $1.50 you could have spent in the spring of 1991. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Apocalypse 5000 from 2021 in Floating World Comics. Ken Landgraf is a cartoonist with roots stretching back to the High Bronze Age, whose work as a penciler and inker was found in a variety of DC and Marvel mags beginning in the late 70s. He was also an early proponent of self-publishing, launching the Landgraphics label in 1979, producing only a handful of comics, but working alongside the likes of Neil Adams on small press titles like Rock Comics and Starfighters. The material in Apocalypse 5000 was originally published a little bit later in New York City Outlaws, which ran from 84 to 86. These comics are raw and unvarnished in a way that appears to trace lines of descent from both mainstream and underground sources. Imagine, if you will, Rich Buckler's massively influential Deathlock stories, with a bit of Don McGregor's Killraven and possibly even Kirby's Command-D, only filtered through the sensibilities of a Spain Rodriguez and his trailblazing underground superhero Trash Man. The story is about the world after the end of the world, with the hidden remnants of humanity forced to live under protective domes and made to serve the cruel androids who serve the computer pyramids, in whose name the surviving members of the human species are enslaved. In this landscape of death, we are introduced to Eric Firedancer, a freedom fighter against the hordes of robot monsters hunting the wreckage of the old world for meat. These are claustrophobic stories, chronicles of a world ground down into paste by atrocity, in which heroes are propelled forward by the most basic of exigencies, to be left alone and to live free from harassment by evil robots and computer overlords. Throughout, I was struck by another kinship from that fecund 70s era. Jack Katz is the First Kingdom, another kind of future history, another offshoot of the Undergrounds in terms of conception, distribution, and ethos. Just as in Katz's epic, the vision of humanity on display throughout Apocalypse 5000 alternates between dogged fatalism and heroic steadfastness. Eric locates his grandfather near the ruins of San Francisco prior to setting out to find the remnants of human resistance, revealed in a dream during the opening pages of the story. This is powerful stuff. Landgraf's dense, feverish incline seems at times a hybrid of Justin Green and Wally Wood, endlessly readable. The only real complaint is that this short book goes by too quick, with the story barely seeming to have begun before running out of pages. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batgirls number 19 from DC Comics in 2023. And so we reach the end of the road for one of my favorite books. When I returned to comics at the tail end of 2021, Batgirls practically jumped off the shelves and into my arms. I had completely forgotten how much I liked these characters after literal decades of seeing them put through the ringer, abused, discarded, altered almost beyond recognition by a company that seemed constitutionally unable to do right by female characters. Bad decisions can haunt good characters for a long time, and so has Stephanie Brown suffered in the years since the execrable War Games. Well, that was a long time ago, long past the statute of limitations for terrible stories, especially now that she's been in other subsequent terrible stories. The wheel turns. O fortuna velut luna statu variabilis, as goes the Latin. Batgirls was at times a joyous book, a series dedicated to the rehabilitation of a group of characters who've all experienced ups and downs, not merely Steph, but Cassie Kane, and yes, even Barbara Gordon, living together in a brownstone and driving around the city in an old beater. This final issue wraps a bow on this phase of the Batgirls' lives, hopefully not without having proven the point that people still like these characters, and in their most recognizable incarnations. All credit in the world to writers Becky Cloonan and Michael W. Conrad for making these characters come alive as themselves, recognizably human and funny. But series MVP remains the indefatigable Rico Renzi, whose work on this book has made him without question my favorite current colorist. Batgirls featured a number of different artists over the course of its short run, but remained recognizably itself due to his striking and distinctive palette. Dynamic, by turns subtle and raucous, it's down to Renzi's work that Batgirls was, month in and month out, one of the very best looking books on the stands from any publisher. I'll miss this book and these creators a great deal, more than I would have ever credited when I first took the plunge, those many months ago. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Archangel Phantom Wings from Marvel Comics in 1995. Our specimen today is an example of a true rarity in comic book publishing. That is, a mainstream book from Marvel Comics from the mid-90s, no less, printed in glorious black and white. The reason for this notable exception isn't hard to figure. This is one of the most beautiful comic books Marvel has ever published. Sufficiently gorgeous it was judged the addition of color would only detract. Leonardo Manco wasn't a complete rookie by the tail end of 95. He'd made his bones with a year's stint on Hellstorm, which no one really bought, but nevertheless managed to put his name on the map. That was followed by the short-lived Druid, Marvel's only real attempt to sell Dr. Druid as anything more than a paunchy punchline. And that book was canceled before it ever really got off the ground. Now, Angel has never received a solo push from Marvel, not even a miniseries at the height of the character's popularity as Archangel. For that reason alone, this is a notable story. It actually does take place in a specific moment in the continuity of the X-Books, just after the publication of 95's Sabretooth Special, which featured that notorious rascal Rascal facing off against the 5 original X-Men. It wasn't a clean victory by any means, and the story begins with Warren Worthington III recuperating from those injuries, both physical and mental. Sabretooth got in his head, and the story begins with him moping around despite the best efforts of his then-girlfriend Psylocke. From there, he's kidnapped and chained to a wall, held captive in an unknown location by a mysterious woman who was herself apparently suffering from serious mental illness. She's also under constant attack from flocks of aggressive birds, and laboring under the misconception that Archangel has some special rapport with the animals. Of course, we know Angel can't talk to birds, so there's no respite from the never-ending replay of Tippi Hedren's worst nightmare. Peter Milligan's script gives Manco a great deal to work with. Pages stuffed with detail, moody hatching, luscious spotted blacks, truly next-level compositions on every page. There's also a smidgen of genuine eroticism, in the form of an extended sequence featuring Warren's battered wings sensually cleaned and polished by his mysterious captor. The X-books from this period carry a frankly ghastly reputation, largely deserved, sad to say, considering I was on board at the time. When they worked, it was mainly down to individual talent carving out singular projects on the periphery of the main titles. Consequently, you most likely have never even heard of this comic, but you really should seek it out at your earliest opportunity. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marjorie Finnegan Temporal Criminal #1 from AWA in 2021. Although it may not look it from the outside, the series is the brainchild of one Mr. Garth Ennis, a name you might recognize from books like The Demon, Dix, and Medieval Spawn Witchblade, to name just a few of his more famous works. There are essentially two Garths Ennis. The first Ennis writes stories about man's inhumanity to man, the heavy personal toll of masculine socialization, and the military-industrial complex. The other Ennis writes about that stuff too, just in a funny way. Marjorie Finnegan maybe isn't as far off the beaten path as it might seem for Ennis then. He's all about bad jokes and Bugs Bunny-style ultraviolence. What's slightly different here is the tone. A light and frothy sci-fi sex farce with a curvaceous career criminal at the center. Sort of like if the Time Bandits were a hot blonde with a shotgun. Frankly, you had me at hot blonde with a shotgun, but you can probably already guess that. Marjorie's a thief, you see, and we first meet her in the act of thieving, stealing the Pharaoh's treasure right out of his tomb. Except, of course, she miscalculates slightly and has to blast her way out of the pyramid, just her and her 12 gauge against the armies of Ramses the Great. So, definitely leaning more towards the Marvel Knights Punisher than Punisher Max. There's a lightness here. The book is quick on his feet and doesn't linger long enough for any setup to lose its novelty. A sequence where the temporal federales bust another time traveler for selling howitzers to farmers living along the English coast 1,300 years ago ends with a boat full of dead Vikings and a Nazi refugee from the Battle of Stalingrad getting 10,000 volts up the urethra. It's that kind of book, so proceed accordingly. The whole thing would be inert if it weren't for the art by Croatian Goran Sejuka. He's had a long career all the way back to the early 2000s at Vertigo, and he's frankly one of the best artists currently working. He knows how to draw both staircases and long establishing shots from an overhead angle, which puts him head and shoulders above a huge percentage of everyone else working today. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja #7 from Marvel Comics in 1989. The story continues to get weirder as Alfie Omegan's reality-warping powers continue to make things weirder for our heroes. The story begins with John Doe held at gunpoint by both American and Soviet forces. He's able to talk himself out of that tight spot, of course, although he's soon being shot at once again by Colonel Novikova. Dr. Yagi is still trapped in the barn with the dying Sergeant Deb Levin, joined now by Sergeant Sargent, John Doe's firearms instructor, and almost certainly Larry Hama's hat-tip to the great Joseph Heller. But within no time flat, John Doe and Colonel Vivara both learn the truth about the mysterious farm on which they've been ambushed. It's actually a Russian military laboratory devoted to adapting warheads filled with now inert nuclear fissile material to carry chemical and biological agents, a process the story assures us is almost certainly also being conducted by the United States military. Meanwhile, the Watchmen parallels continue with the introduction of yet another improbably named character, Dr. Candy Goodstroke, who arrives in Washington to try and get inside Alfie's head. She's brought with her Rorschach test, of course, which inevitably just happened to look like an axe murderer wearing a clown costume. Is that insight into Alfie's character going to be relevant? Well, next issue promises another flashback to Alfie and John's childhood at the orphanage, teased in the next issue box as Hot Time at the Orphanage or Ask Me No Questions. This could, in other hands, be a very grim story, what with it being about ninjas battling omnipotent psychics in the middle of World War III. Larry Hama, however, is bound and determined to keep things as light as he can. The Heller connection is important here, and to Hamm's entire corpus. Hamm's intimate familiarity with military life and dedication to capturing its rhythms and mores in what he writes is undergirded by a deep and abiding sense of the absurd. That's one reason G.I. Joe is as funny as it is. There's a deadpan fatalism about military life that comes through even in the toy book, the wisdom of human institutions designed to deal with constant destabilizing change as a way of life. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Slain, the Horn God #4 from 1993 in Fleetway quality. Slain's quest to unite the kingdoms in advance of the war with the forces of the Lord Weird Slothfeg reaches its climax with the final artifact, the Stone of Destiny, burgled from the Avank. Surprisingly, the massive battle with the last of the Neanderthals does not materialize. Rather, despite his ostensible savagery, the Avank is a figure of sympathy. The narration details his loneliness, separated by the veil of death from his wife and his family and his people. These factors render him easily manipulated by the sorceress Migrim, who jumps on the opportunity to take advantage of Slain's uncharacteristic indecision after the stone is stolen back by the Avank. But, would you believe, Slain is more wily than his foes expect. His dithering and his invitation to be distracted is merely cover for a burglary by his closest allies. And so it comes to pass that at the summit of the Bolg Danu, a real mountain in Ireland incidentally, the 4 great artifacts are united in the service of Slain, chosen and consecrated by the ancient earth goddess, who appears before the assembled kings and nobles of Ireland to crown Slain with a helmet of great horns. Will it be enough to stand against the hordes of the Lord Weird, death worshippers, and monsters from beyond the sea? With only 2 issues to go, the stage is set for a truly epic battle, the forces of life and death at war for the future of the Isles. Through it all, Bisley's virtuosity never wavers, although of course the muscle-bound fiends and emaciated ghouls of myth stand out in his work. His mastery of tone and texture only heighten the unreality of the setting. The Avank's underwater cave is a dark, primeval womb. The masked forces of the Lord Weird, supernal faded pastels, as if to emphasize the unreality in which the death cultists swim. Under Bisley's hand, the blank page is transformed into a land and time of primal myth. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at The Brave and the Bold #124 from 1975 in DC Comics. Bob Haney's long run on Brave and the Bold is at once both one of the most beloved and most baffling runs in Batman's history. At a time when the rest of the line doubled down in the direction of the darker flavor of Dark Knight, ushered in by Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil in the early 70s, Haney was still writing stories with a touch of the old Silver Age madness. As a team-up book, Brave and the Bold played by a slightly different set of rules, by necessity accommodating a lot more in the way of fast and loose plotting, in order to fit often very disparate characters into a single issue's worth of story. Issue 124 is a great example of this, and one of the most infamous issues of the entire run. No less an authority than Mark Grunwald called this very comic confounding, and it's not hard to see why. Ostensibly, the story is about a group of terrorists wreaking havoc across Gotham with military-style assault rifles, weapons dangerous enough for the military to assign none other than Sergeant Frank Rock to the investigation. Now, the Rock has to be at least pushing 60 in this story, but he already knows and trusts Batman, so the two set out to stop the murder spree by pooling their resources. The problem is that the terrorists, a group known simply as the Thousand, have figured out Batman and the Rock's greatest weakness. They're in a story being drawn by a man named Jim Aparo from a script by Haney. Now, this is where things get weird, because Aparo and Haney are shown living on Batman's Earth, not Earth Prime, and the events of Aparo's story are shown to directly guide the events of the real investigation. See what I mean? The story implies Aparo and Haney are living gods on Batman's world, as the ultimate resolution of the menace of the Thousand is shown to be Aparo dodging the gunman long enough to draw a satisfactory conclusion for Batman and the Rock. Both delightful and headache-inducing at once, eccentric and meta, as only Bob Haney could deliver. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Skateman #1 from 1983 in Pacific Comics. The late, great Neil Adams was one of the best artists to ever work in comics, without question. But when left to his own devices, his tastes could be strange. Just look at any of the comics he produced in recent decades. Batman Odyssey is the go-to example, a very strange book that nevertheless managed to become one of the more popular Batman stories of recent times, both despite and because of its off-kilter energy. Now, despite his name in big letters on the cover, Adams doesn't quite deserve all the blame for Skateman. It's definitely a very strange comic, but it wasn't his idea. The character began life as a screenplay by John Ballard before being adapted by by Adams and Jim Sherman. This was back in the early 80s when Adams was surrounded by people who knew how to draw just like him because he taught them all how to draw. And if you go back and check the numbers, that's a surprisingly vast group of people over a large period of time. In any event, it's a credit to the man's style that it still reads very much like an Adams story, despite being someone else's idea and someone else's pencils over his layouts. His storytelling is the dominant voice throughout. As for the story, this is a rather notorious book, and I'm not going to pull any punches, because while it is emphatically not a hidden gem worthy of reappraisal, it's nonetheless an interesting failure. The story is about a Vietnam vet who's really good at roller skating, who gets involved in roller derby after returning from the war. But due to some match fixing, the man who would be skate man accidentally kills a man. Then he spends much of the rest of the issue learning to use his skating prowess for good by taking on bullies and biker gangs, abusing Mexican farm workers, attempting to unionize. A good cause, close to Adam's heart, which may explain his connection to the character. And that's not all. There's a short future world sci-fi tale in the back, with the young Andy Kubert putting down his best impression of his father, doing inks for Jack Arata, and a Rock Warrior strip by Paul S. Power, another creator in the mold of Ken Landgraf. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at The Amazing Spider-Man number 121 from 1973, or, to be more precise, Marvel's recent facsimile edition of that fateful issue. For indeed, this is one of the most significant issues of any Marvel comic, perhaps even the most controversial single issue the company has ever published. By 1973, Spider-Man was well ensconced as the company's flagship character, and without question, the close attention paid to the soap opera life of Peter Parker was one of the main factors behind that success. Spider-Man's world was rich, filled not merely with colorful foes, but friends, family, and lovers, a complex web of associates that had been one of the hallmarks of the strip from the very beginning. Was the strip in need of a shake-up in 1973? Probably. 10 years is a long time in the life of any book, and with every one of the original creators gone, the desire was strong on the part of the younger talent to make their mark on the franchise. Writer Jerry Conway wasn't a newbie, and neither was the editor Roy Thomas. It's telling that they waited until Stan was out of town to go to press on this issue, and according to the legend, by the time he got back from a business trip in England, Stan had forgotten all about supposedly signing off on the unprecedented plot twist contained in these pages. In hindsight, of course, it's easy to gloss over the actual details of the story, but reading it again with a fresh set of eyes, it remains remarkably upsetting. The setup no different than any number of other such yarns, the hero's opposite number having kidnapped the love of their life to provoke them to confrontation. Whatever the reason, the fight takes a turn, the mighty hero is proven inescapably infallible, and the amazing Spider-Man cannot save the woman he loves. Gwen Stacy died 50 years ago this spring, and for once it's not empty hype to say the world of comics would never be the same again. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Impulse 17 from 1996 in DC Comics. The 90s was a good period for The Flash, sales-wise. Mark Waid's character-defining tenure on Wally West had long enough coattails to launch a spin-off that lasted over 7 years, also written by Waid for the first stretch. Impulse is Bart Allen, grandson of Barry Allen, raised in the far future and sent back to the late 20th century to live something as close to a normal teenage life as possible. The problem is, Bart was raised in a virtual reality video game, due to his being a speedster from birth and otherwise completely ungovernable. Impulse featured Bart Allen learning how to live his life in the real world at something resembling a normal speed, raised by surrogate parent Max Mercury, and settling in Alabama. During its run, Impulse was a bit of a critical darling, and it's not hard to see why. Issue 17 here is a great example of what made the title work. The emphasis on humor and character work were hallmarks of the mid to late 90s post-image wave of back-to-basics books. In practice, that meant Impulse usually offered done-in-one stories with a lighter touch. I picked this book out of a pile of comics to be sorted and found myself laughing throughout. Bart is a funny character here, running circles around everyone else with his elemental impatience, as well as what we would almost certainly now categorize as severe ADHD. Impulse was also the first big break for Humberto Ramos, who would later go on to co-found the Cliffhanger imprint based on the popularity of his explicitly cartoony manga-influenced work on this book. This issue features an appearance by the lovely Zatanna Zatara, on tour passing through Alabama. Of course, she's old friends with Max, but doesn't get on that well with Bart. It's not just the fact that he quickly figures out the trick of talking backwards, which is pretty funny in its own right, but that without even really understanding what he's doing, he manages to dismantle her stage show and rattle her enough to provoke her to exile him to another dimension. And of course, when she goes after him, would you believe her magic stops working and she has to depend on him to be able to get home? As you might imagine, hijinks ensue. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marjorie Finnegan Temporal Criminal number 2 from AWA in 2021. The plot thickens as our girl Marjorie comes face to face with her sister, Harriet Finnegan, Temporal Sheriff, bound and determined to slap handcuffs on her ne'er-do-well sibling. There's no love lost between the two women. As we see in a flashback, Marjorie was responsible for the crossbow bolt that took Harriet's eye. Marjorie's apparently been on a bit of a rampage, as we see at the beginning of the story with a montage of all the great moments in history Marjorie has royally scuppered. Harriet's team has been responsible for fixing everything her sister has put awry, from crashing the crucifixion to laying a giant turd on the head of our esteemed former president. Marjorie is, not to put too fine a point on it, a bit of a scumbag, messing around with the primal stuff of reality for the fun of it. Of course, these dangerous shenanigans have attracted other kinds of scumbags as well, as we are introduced to a pair of Mephistophelian operators surveilling the scene from some kind of infernal remove and directing a team of perverted burglars to ransack Marjorie's hideout while she's busy fist-fighting her sister. Garth Ennis is having a great deal of fun here. That is readily apparent from the outset, lining up a swath of crooks, creeps, and schemers to follow in Marjorie Finnegan's chaotic wake. Someone's after a lost book of the Bible, stolen from the Library of Alexandria all the way back in the 1st century, and it turns out Marjorie was hiding the manuscript inside a copy of Sapphic Astronauts, an interesting name for a possible spin-off, note to self. If you're not a fan of body jokes and frankly blasphemous asides, well, you should probably stay away from Ennis in general. He's got the whole tapestry of time and history to play with here, and the results are a wonder to behold, even given his track record on famously profane stories like Preacher and Hitman. For better or for worse, this is the Ennis I grew up with, a man for whom no sacred cow is ever too big to tip, scourge of religious bigots and bane of chauvinists everywhere. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 8 from Marvel Comics in 1989. In the first place, it must be said that this is one of my favorite covers in the history of the medium, like an EC comic unmoored in time that just happened to land on a Marvel mag some 4 decades late. The issue itself is a flashback to John and Alfie's youth at the orphanage, a miserable childhood by any measure that gets even worse here. As we've already seen so far in the series, the Maryvale Home for Boys was in general a miserable place, run by the aptly named Mr. Bigot, who gleefully skimmed the county payments for the boys' upkeep for the purpose of buying a mink farm and retiring with Nurse Gooch, sour-faced and constantly smoking. The most important thing in the world for young Alfie is his comic book collection, a complete run of Lee and Kirby Fantastic Four, along with a number of other Silver Age classics kept neat in a box and shared only with his pal John. The crux of the issue here is Alfie learning to use his terrible powers, enabled by a shadow of his future self whispering through time to influence the confused and angry child. Of course, Mr. Bigot didn't actually need Alfie's help to fly into a murderous rage. The story tells us quite clearly he's got anger problems and no compunctions about taking out his frustrations on the children in his care. This is where we see John's mettle, even as a child, taking full-on beatings from a grown man for the specific purpose of saving his friends the same fate. Eventually, Alfie gets adopted out of the system by the kindly Omegan family, but a malicious mix-up with his precious box of comics inspires the murderous rage that comes to a fruition with Mr. Bigot's fateful assault on the children with an axe. Notable here is the fill-in artwork from a very young Dale Keown. After 3 years paying dues in the proverbial minor leagues on books like Warlock 5 and Dragon Force, first at Aircel and then at Malibu after Aircel became a division of Malibu, Nth Man is Keown's first Marvel credit. This specific issue is a story about unhappy childhood in the long shadow of child abuse, challenging subject matter that carried over to his star-making work on Peter David's Hulk just a couple months later. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Slain the Horn God number 5 from 1993 in Fleetway quality. And so finally we arrive at the crux of the matter after 4 issues of preamble, exposition, and digression, the main event, the war between Slain and the Lord Weird Slough Feg. Both men are avatars of the Great Horn God, both leading great armies into battle, but as unlike in worship as conceivable. Slain represents the principle of life, represented by the goddess of fertility and lust, the feminine principles of fecundity and mystery. Slain fights for nothing less than the restoration of the ancient prerogative of the goddesses, which also represents a political fight within his own coalition, to not doubt. If you've ever taken any anthropology, you'll remember that the time of the ancient priestesses, supposed era of the matriarchs in some distant mythologized past, is rarely if ever supported by the archaeological record, but that belief remains strong to this day, and it's on behalf of that belief that Slain fights. And since we're on the subject, these fights are truly something else to behold. If you've maybe grown impatient on seeing Bisley draw exposition and travelogue, even through the mystic lands of ancient Britain, this is where things get truly brutal. Bisley Grizzly's facility with violence needs no introduction. It's no coincidence that his signature achievement in American comics is his work on DC's Lobo, another character symbolizing pure violent id with a side order of sexual debauchery. For those waiting to see Slain finally, after all this time, cut loose, this is where it's at. Slain rides out to battle on his great war chariot, covered in sharpened pikes and knives and barreling into the enemy ranks at the speed of a galloping horse. One may, of course, question the wisdom of organizing a massive battle over a frozen lake, a danger for both sides, certainly. When Slain falls beneath the cracking ice, there is only a momentary pause in the battle, as within a heartbeat the king rises from the deep, possessed in the heat of battle by the glorious and unpredictable warp spasm which deforms and distorts his flesh to monstrous proportions. In the vulgar vernacular, we see Slain hulk out with a battle axe, and the results are as terrifying as you'd hope. Ultimately, the battle comes down to a principle of life versus death, two sides of the horned god at war with one another. Although putrefied and rotting, the Lord Weird nevertheless represents a notable conservative principle of the primacy of death and the power of resentment of the living, a pungent and repulsive ideology that worships humongous maggots from beyond our dimension. Maggots and rotting meat are as much a part of the cycle of life as sex and harvest. Slain's political appeal in restoring the ancient high kingship lies in the restoration of balance, a balance promised by a return to the ancient ways and a rejection of modernity in the form of ever metastasizing death cults. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Sleepwalker number 12 from 1992 in Marvel Comics. This series has come in for a fair amount of abuse over the years, lumped into the pile with so much other 90s chaff, when the dismissal always struck me as quite unfair. Sure, there's the almost certainly apocryphal story of the series being promoted internally with the phrase, Sandman done right. But in the fullness of time, that condescending anecdote says less about the quality of Sleepwalker than the culture surrounding Marvel editorial at the time. There's absolutely nothing in common between the two books other than the general motif of sleep. What this book had in its favor was a story by Marvel veteran Bob Budiansky, familiar to a generation of readers as the writer of the large part of Marvel's original Transformers series, and one of the many men who contributed to the earliest lore surrounding those venerable bots. Still important to recall, he was a penciler, arguably a better penciler than he was a writer, even as he mostly stepped away from art as the 1980s wore on. His run on the tail end of the original Ghost Rider series is one of my favorite Marvel runs ever, and may very well end up featured on this channel one day. Sleepwalker needed only gesture towards its regular artist to justify its place on the stands. Brett Blevins was already recognized as a talent, responsible for a number of popular fill-ins across the X-Men line in the late 80s. Fellow young journeyman Mike Manley was Blevins' inker for much of the early run, and the results were undeniably excellent. Issue 12 of Sleepwalker was an artistic fill-in, however, with Blevins and Manley out in favor of layouts from a young hotshot you may have heard of by name of Joe Quesada. This was far from Quesada's first Marvel work. After a brief spell at Valiant, he matriculated to work across both Marvel and DC, including mini covers, fill-ins, annuals, backups, brief runs on forgotten books like the Dungeons & Dragons spin-off Spelljammer and The Ray. In other words, Quesada was a busy boy. It's hard not to see why, based just on the evidence of this fill-in. Quesada's work is bold and interesting, focused on storytelling and mood. He even found time for Sleepwalker, providing layouts not merely for this fill-in, but also a cover and a pinup for the Sleepwalker Holiday Special later this same year. Even on just layouts, as finished by Michael Baer and Quesada's soon-to-be frequent creative partner Jimmy Palmiotti, the finished product is fresh and pleasing. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at DC Comics Presents 66 from 1984. This issue of DCP presents the first meeting between Superman and the Demon Etrigan, created by Jack Kirby in 1972. Although by 1983 the character had been around for over a decade, he hadn't had his own series since the first volume of The Demon was canceled at the tail end of 73 after 16 issues. After that cancellation, he did what a lot of DC characters did, shuffled off to limbo, there to wait for the occasional call to appear alongside Batman in the pages of The Brave and the Bold, which he did twice, once in 73 and again in 77, and for good measure the year after saw an appearance in Batman Family. Although Jason Blood had always been established as a resident of Gotham City since the days of Kirby, they never quite took the step of integrating him closer to Batman, and so too in this issue of DC Comics Presents, as that rarest of artifacts, a Superman story that takes place in Gotham City and yet does not feature an appearance by the Dark Knight. Of course, Superman does go to enlist his pal for aid, but as this is an issue of World's Finest, it's explained that Batman is off on a mission with the Outsiders, a plug for the Cape Crusaders' then latest ongoing. This was also, I believe, the last appearance of Etrigan prior to his appearance during the first year of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing later in '84. That story revitalized the character by inserting him into a more contemporary horror milieu, separate from Kirby's exaggerated creature feature tone, always more redolent of 1930s Hollywood than anything from subsequent decades. That slight tonal dissonance remains a crucial element of the character, and no less here, under the auspices of no less a creative team than Len Wein and the great Joe Kubert. Now, I've made no secret in the past regarding the fact that my appreciation of Kubert lags behind, perhaps, but the fact is that Joe Kubert invariably draws everyone like they're dog-tired. Even his Superman looks like he just pulled an all-nighter. Kubert's Etrigan seems halfway between Kirby's bouncing ball of an infernal energy and Bissett and Totlebin's gnarled and animalistic monster. Kubert didn't draw superheroes often in his later career, and it was a special event when he did. He was still in charge of DC's indelible line of war books, and their twilight as a commercial force, but still buoyed by the imprimatur of the Master's indelible chunky brush line.